great. I mean, you guys are together, as I was thinking, longer than most other relationships, marriages, dating, what have you. Lesson 1, commitment beats volume. Brings me to lesson number 2, which is, don't reinvent the wheel. Don't reset what works. Don't chase those features. And that brings us to lesson 3, which is know when to break your own rules. I think that's a great way to get to lesson number 4, because real growth happens when you're learning to make it visible. You're looking through the patterns. And lesson number 4, if you can't see learning, you're guessing. Yeah? It's not because there's less data. It's maybe just because it's harder to tell what it's actually teaching you, or if it's teaching you something at all. So if we want to get practical here and look at what, for example, with teams, there's the learning problem. What are we actually understanding better or faster than before? Stay with you, Andy, about, thinking about what you're learning and knowing whether your learning is actually improving.
That's a great question. Yeah, and we are, investing quite a lot in AI and automation solutions on a couple of surfaces. One is Apple Search Ads for sure. Another is App Store optimization in the Play Store specifically. We have 2 products. One, the Catch Base, which is a reinforcement learning for Apple Search Ads, really focused on optimizing that bidding, bidding for keywords, what keywords to bid on, how much to bid for them, how often to change the bids, and it does that all automatically, and it can optimize for ROAS. And on the press play side, this is really slightly more advanced system, which kind of builds a hypothesis, tests that hypothesis with a generated asset for the Play Store, maybe an icon or a screenshot or a preview video, something like this, or a short description. It runs those, runs that experiment, deploys it, measures the result. And then tries to understand whether that was a win or a lose. It tries to understand, what has it learned from that? Like, to your point about learning and how do we know if it really is getting smarter? What we see, what we see with both systems, but I think it's probably the more impressive lesson is what we see from Press Play, and that's that it can not only iterate itself towards, better performance on asset optimization in the Play Store for a given title. So through a essentially kind of closed loop system of agentic AI, it's validating hypotheses and or invalidating them, and updating, coming up with new ideas, new hypotheses to test, and iterating towards good results, right? But I think the real critical part for us, where we realized, okay, this is not just throwing a lot of stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks, but rather it's generating learnings which are actually of value to the business and across a portfolio. It's actually what we got pretty early on with Wildlife Studios. We have a very concrete example. They had a game called Sky Warriors. It was like a plane game with fighter combat game with like jet planes, right? So Press Play came up with an icon which was incredibly busy. It had just an incredible amount of detail in there, and icons are not very big, right? So you couldn't. We're talking about a few pixels here and there at some point, like if you really zoomed in. But it was like the artists, they saw this asset and they're like, well, we would never design an icon like this. It's way too busy. It's cluttered. But it was like, it got like 40% uplift, like from this one test. It was crazy.
You never tell with these things, can you?
So first of all, like, they admitted they would never have done this. Their hypothesis, which it validated, was actually that this is going to make it look more like a game, because all this detail was like, it has a head-up display and it's showing weapons and, counters and things like this. So it made it much clearer than the original asset that it was testing against that this was a game. We validated that hypothesis also, like offline, manually, because we were still building the product at that time. The artists who were, so surprised at this one, understanding like the learning as the sort of the system had decided what the learning was, that it was like, this is making it more like a game. They were really keen to test that on their other titles. So they didn't use Press Play for that. They created similar style assets for their other titles, which was like, it's just a tennis game and some other titles in different categories, different genres, and they got similar double-digit uplift. So this was a learning which the machine had generated, which was actually transferable across a whole bunch of titles. So it was like a good organizational learning that they could apply elsewhere.
It worked for one genre, but not for the others, but it actually carried across them. That's not often. I mean, when I'm thinking about this, Andrew, looking at this from your side, what kind of changes take place? When it's part of the wider growth system, as we said, there's a learning problem. Then there's the winning of like, what are we actually understanding? How it's hard to tell when something's actually teaching you something. So what do you change when it does?
One, Andy, that's fascinating on what you did was
Yeah.
with the icon, and we should talk about that in the future for Onyx. But
Sure.
yeah, it can be, there's a lot of noise that comes around it. And it's like, there's also learnings that are great things and incremental step forward. And there's great things that are like, as Andy's referencing, 40% lifts and things you should pay attention to. And so I think we're always trying to learn, as I've mentioned, the consumer a lot about them, but also like when you get into life cycle marketing, what are the key drivers? Where are we getting big lift points? And like, what are some big swings we can take, and did they work or not? Often they don't. Most times big swings don't work, but you got to keep trying them, because sometimes you hit these things like 40% lift that is like monumental to your trajectory. And so if you never take them, you're never going to know. And so, but I'd say like when we find concrete learnings that have driven good growth, it becomes an anchor, for how we approach things. And often like that's like going all the way back to like the hunt example, even of working with Phiture early on and getting this kind of like offline maps, waypoint, tap the map to understand public private. That drove a large conversion uplift, which I did not mention before. That was monumental in onboarding folks. And so that was an anchor in, okay, we have something here. Let's keep evolving that as we have it, and let's put the big swing somewhere else for the time being. As we've evolved, like, that was, 6 years ago, we've definitely come back to that and taken bigger swings again. And our user base has grown from a Western hunter to the whole United States. They have a lot of different use cases, honestly. Like it's more complex. But I think when you find those things, it's gold at the moment as you're growing as a business, and you're like, sweet, let's lean into this. Now let's put our creative thinking somewhere else. So we can find big wins across the life cycle of the user and areas where we can access new users, and I've seen groups too, where it's like, they kind of see those big learnings. They say, oh, that's kind of neat. And they continue taking big swings in the same place, which can also be good. But I'm like, you might be wasting your time. You found something really, really good. Maybe you should find something really, really good in the next stage of your user journey, or the earlier stage, whatever it might be.
That's a really good point.
That really is. I was just thinking, it's almost like incrementality. How much extra lift can you get if you do something really well, really, really well? No, you have to sort of know when that's good, that's sorted, tick that box, and go over to another feature, or go over to another part of the app. And that's really gold, because that's going to tell you where to invest your resources, where to invest your time.
Yeah, no, and I think resources and time is typically, and for smaller businesses, right? We worked with Phiture with the AI Apple search ads. And a big point for us there actually was, we had one person trying to manage all user acquisition channels. We knew that Apple search ads was a primary driver for all of our apps. And this individual did not have enough time to put to the channel. It was purely a resource and time thing. And Apple search ad automation and the tooling they had, gave us a big uplift in installs, and gave this human more time to help us focus across kind of our acquisition efforts. So that was kind of the application there, which was very valuable to us.
That's awesome. We have to thank Apple there for their terrible interface on the standard campaign management, like, that's built into their dashboard. It's like everybody complains about it, and it takes them a lot of time. So it's like, it's a very easy one to like leave to one side in favor of like channels with more scale.
So I want to go full circle, final lesson here, because that's where we started, talking about where a product is in its life and the learnings. And lesson number 5 is, guess what? Growth priorities change with maturity. And we hit upon this before, Andrea, talking about where you are on the S curve and the importance of that. And some products are still proving themselves. Others are well established. So I'll give a question out to a little bit of both of you. I'm seeing that a lot of teams are treating those situations as if they're one and the same, and that is the source, the core source of the problem. Am I right?
It's very detrimental. And I think, Andy, you mentioned it too. You could still win. You can fight your way uphill from using the same things all the way there. It doesn't mean you won't win, but I think it's a much harder journey. And I think if like one, as we've talked a lot, just recognizing where you're at and how you apply your mind and your business and like where you should focus changes. And I mean, an example for like the maturity curve is, I mean, when you become a mature business, retention becomes so important, right? You have a lot of subscribers to retain. You have a whole different side of the business that is important to maintain. And there's a lot of long-term thinking to a mature business on the steps you're going to make, 6, 12, 18 months out and how you can win there. And when you're a new business and you're trying to evolve, those things do matter. You should know where you're going and you should have a strategy. But the reality is you're trying to find these big hits we've talked about, like 40% lifts, and you're trying to find them as quickly as possible. And you need to focus in on how do you get users into your product and how do you drive good conversion. Retention is an afterthought when you're early on in the stage. You need to create that problem for yourself. But I think if you said, I'm going to take the playbook of I focus on all facets in retention as I roll out my business or scale it, you've just given yourself a lot of overhead, and many of those activities aren't going to give you a lot of value in the early stages of your business. So if you can focus in on your key drivers with your team, you'll unlock growth a lot faster.
What's the moment when it becomes very clear for you, Andrew, that acquisition alone isn't the lever? It's retention. It's even looking to retargeting and saying, we had these people, we can get them back.
There's no maybe perfect moment. I think I know like in the industry, there's folks that say like, oh, like 40% of your users you're focusing on retention. You have this big user base. I think each business might be a little bit different in how they might look at that. There's a lot of different signals, right? We pride ourselves in you can still call us and talk to CX professionals about our app, and we will help you out with it anytime. Give us a call.
That's great.
And it's been a big piece for us. And especially, I mean, we have people going out into the outdoors in risky situations, and we want you to be successful. We want you to be safe. We want to help you as much as we can. But when you tie that to like, the evolution, well, when you're getting a lot more calls from your existing users about things that you need, you have a lot of users renewing, and there's a big facet of how do you focus on those folks. And I think from retargeting, you're like, we should bring them back in, which also poses a question of why do we have to keep bringing them back in? Let's focus on retention. And we obviously will always have to retarget, but there's just kind of this critical mass that I think each business fills at some point within their journey where you're like, we have a core product offering. People are buying it. We're keeping them, years 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever it might be, whatever that life cycle is. And so we really have to pivot our thinking. And I think even, a note on the product management side, which I've also done a lot at OnX in areas from just like development and building, that also changes how you think there, right? And what you're like, do you focus on the key experiences that you have and improve them versus how do you evolve into new experiences if you don't quite have it yet? You're not solving the key problems for the consumer. So there's a lot of shift that takes place as you get into that stage. And it also presents a lot of challenge. Like you do need more people. Like an example for like product teams who focus on retention, you'll never do if you have a team that does both retention and growth in building development, you will never prioritize growth because the users you have today matter the most to that team. When you have to weigh a decision, you're like, well, that's hurting our existing customers. We're going to fix that.
Yeah.
And so it becomes a balance of then you're kind of spreading your teams out to say like, okay, we have to focus on all these different things, which is a blessing, but it's also a different way of thinking.
A lot there to unpack, Andy. What would you like to say to that? Because again, you're working with so many different companies. There must be a thread here about what happens, what breaks when you're ignoring your maturity. You're running the same full funnel playbook everywhere at all times.
Yeah, it's a good question. And the example that Andrew just gave about, building for existing users and keeping them around and keeping them happy versus building the stuff which the newer audiences and the new folks coming in are maybe struggling with. I think that's very multifaceted. I mean, you could do a whole episode on that, actually, because once a product's been around for multiple years, those people might be quite different, actually, in terms of like, the folks that were early adopters and have been using the product for years. They're probably getting a different kind of value out of it. First of all, they have different expectations about what it is and what it isn't. The marketing has probably also changed over that time. So it's maybe emphasizing different things. Also in an effort to keep kind of fishing in new ponds, as it were, and like, making sure that you're sort of still acquiring the sort of total addressable audience rather than just those early adopters that you got in the early days. So the people coming in year 3 or year 4 are coming in maybe with different expectations and different needs, and they're coming in at a different level of maturity. By nature, they're not the early adopters. And so they maybe need to be looked after in a different way. That's not to mean that you have to build 2 different products for them, but they probably need to be onboarded differently. They maybe have certain other expectations about how the product's going to interact with them that the early users have a completely different feel about. That's all sounding maybe very abstract, but I can bring that into a very concrete example with SoundCloud, where I used to work. I was focused on driving user retention, which actually we were looking at that in a few different buckets. So like new user retention, existing user retention, and returning users. So in other words, like folks who had been absent for some time and essentially reactivation of users. And I know that like, one of the big things we identified, to kind of keep this short, as a tactic and a channel, was to build out like a real-time push notification service where we would be letting folks know about new music hitting the platform, or like music from their favorite artists, et cetera. Probably shouldn't be that controversial, but like got a lot of pushback from the product team about, hey, we do you really want to be sending push notifications to our users? Is it really going to piss off like these people over here? It didn't actually, and we had the numbers to back that up. You will have users cohorts of different ages may be expecting different things from the product, and it is difficult to please all of them, I think, and to get the balance right with certain of your activities, that you're not making the product worse and less tolerable or like less enjoyable for the folks who actually have been your most loyal users. It's an important thing to make sure that you're taking care of.
It's important learning also to hand on as you're thinking about the product and the audience. And we talked a lot about continuity. I want to bring it back to that as we wrap this up, because continuity is harder than it sounds, but it's definitely more valuable than many teams think. It's about carrying the learning forward, knowing when to diverge, knowing, for you, for example, Andrew, when to have that playbook, but when to break that playbook, because maybe it's a good framework, but there are those exceptions. So when you look back across the different phases of Onyx, from one product to many, continuity, what does it actually mean to you now compared to maybe earlier in the journey of your company?
Continuity early on meant repeating what worked, as I've kind of mentioned through the podcast. Now it means carrying forward why something worked and being willing to change everything else. And in many ways, as I've kind of referenced throughout this podcast too, it's you got to know when to take the learnings and pull them across, and like a solid customer understanding as a basis. And, good customer information will help you understand how to pull continuity across the org. And I think for any business, it could be different. If you have 2 apps in the same stage, in the same category, I bet you there's a lot of things that transfer over pretty well. But you need to make sure you understand the audience you have in both apps. And if that answer is true, do it, test it. But I think it's just like, it's not a copy and paste kind of cookie cutter thing. And it's just something, if you come in with that mindset, you can kind of quickly discern where you should focus in and copy and paste things where you should apply a lot more effort to get the right solution answer. That's been an evolution for us and a learning over years. But I'd say if you're starting that now yourself at whatever company, like just really think about what you need to do for the consumer that you're trying to serve, and then look at all of the things you have available to you and take what will work.
I mean, this episode is, of course, all linking back to the 2026 Full Funnel App Growth Series and the playbook that you're a part of as well, Andy. And we talk about continuity there at length. So again, what is it that you maybe see teams who get continuity right actually doing differently? You know, there's always something, there's like an algorithm for success. You know, there's something that these companies that succeed are doing differently than others. And that marks them. That's their trait. What are you seeing that teams do that is different, but therefore even more so effective?
I think it really all comes back to leveraging intent, understanding the intent first of all, and then leveraging that effectively across all the growth surfaces that you're working on, right? Regardless of how many surfaces that is, and that, of course, like to our earlier parts of the conversation, depends a bit on the maturity of the app, and to the point where it could actually be that you've got multiple user journeys with different kinds of audiences, with different kinds of intent, coming to the product for different reasons, but like all having a coherent, continuous kind of user journey with high continuity, high cohesion, coming in through those different channels. But I think the more that you can pay attention to what that intent is, and to be cognizant, not just cognizant of it, but like actually working to continue that expectation that that intent will be met. And then, of course, also meeting that expectation in the app. Whether that's just one user journey or 5 different user journeys with 5 different kinds of intent from different audiences, that's what I see really high performing teams like really excelling at, and just the inverse, of course, is treating all users the same and with scant regard for like what they're actually like, what their intent is, and or even contradicting that with the messaging or the product experience that you're putting in front of them. And I see a lot of apps doing that as well.
Yeah, well, that's why we have this series, because that is not a sustainable model. And this is all about sustainable full funnel growth, how it's built, not just by chasing the tactics, chasing the quick wins, but carrying the learnings forward, knowing when to adapt, understanding intent, understanding your audience. I could go on, and I might have you back again because we touched upon so many really important topics here, but we have finished our first masterclass in any case, and our first 5 lessons. So Andy, Andrew, I just want to thank you for sharing so openly and also being so fundamental in how you're speaking. We have lessons here. We have something we can apply. So thanks ever so much.
Thanks, Peggy.
Yeah, thank you, Peggy.
Of course, thank you, because you have been tuning in. You've given us your time and understanding sustainable growth, what it is, and how you get bigger and more complex as a company. It doesn't necessarily mean that your playbook is bigger and more complex. And speaking of the playbook, that's all in the Full Funnel Growth Playbook that will be coming soon, where Andrew, you're a great example of what that looks like in the real world, and Andy, always providing a framework that we can follow. So this episode, as I said, part of that series powered by Archie. If you've learned loads today, and I know that you have, the playbook, it goes deeper, and you can find out details on where to look for it and follow the playlist, because we have a number of podcasts in this series, and this valuable resource will be live soon. So until then, subscribe, share, stay tuned, and all of the details are in the show notes.